Interview with Elizabeth Scobie, copyright Brevard County Historical Commission, 1992. Tell us when and where you were born.
I was born at Sharps, Florida on December the 6th, 1907. My mother was the only daughter of Dr. Holmes, and I was the first granddaughter, so I sort of supposed that maybe that's why, and no hospitals around, that she went home and her mother could take care of us.
Well, when did your family first come to the Brevard area?
Well, my grandfather said that he came in the fall and winter of 1974, and
he must have been 1874.
I mean 1874. I wasn't really thinking. So they said they needed a doctor down there. I think they'd had several doctors in the area, but needed a doctor, and several cousins had died, they said, of consumption in Ohio, and he moved down with his 3 sons then, and to get into the milder climate, and but that didn't save them, because years later there was a big forest fire down there, and the 2 older sons, Ed and Frank, fought that fire, and you know, one of them died the following April and the other one following May. I guess too much inhaling of smoke, and they had so hardly, I guess, anything to do for it.
Mm. And your mother's family?
That was my mother's. She was only daughter, and she was born after they came down here in the same house, but it was City Point when she was born, and when I was born it was Sharps. And they didn't record birth certificates way back then, you know, so my mother was working for the telephone company during the war, and you had to know who you were. So there was a Miss Faber there that had been there at the home when she was born, and she could give affidavit and Bible records, so she got a birth certificate. And my grandfather had registered me, and he was the second doctor to record his certificate in Brevard County. And Dr. Wilson was one of the early doctors. He was the first.
So your grandfather's name was George
W. Holmes.
And tell me a little bit about how he did his doctoring. I understand
Well,
it was unusual.
Yes, he had an office there in the side of the house, and I know we could walk through, and there was bottles and bottles of pills, and you weren't allowed to touch anything. And so he could fill his own prescriptions. And sometimes I think when he was out and not going to be home soon, my grandmother did it. And he was also, as soon as the railroad was extended down, he was made surgeon of the Florida East Coast Railroad. But he didn't like surgery, and unless it was an emergency, he sent him to the Florida East Coast Hospital in St. Augustine. And my sister told me he was still getting passes on the railroad the year when he died in December of 1926.
Would he travel on the train?
He did. There was a story I mentioned that he went to Sebastian to see people. He went on the train, and they said they would spread the word around that the good doctor was there, and everybody that needed to see him would come in. And then they told me about Miss L.C. Croft, an attorney, one time. He said your grandfather walked through palmettos to get to one patient, and I thought, well, that was easy to do because there was a lot of palmettos. But he didn't tell me then, but I talked to another man in Melbourne that had written a lot of history, the Indian River steamboats, And he told me that it was in 1891 and they were moving the lighthouse back because the sea was getting too near. And this man fell from about 25 feet and drove his bones into the planks. Well, they said they started out from Canaveral. I knew grandfather lived in Sharps, and they got over to Georgiana and then across the river and up there. And when they got up, they found out he was back in Georgiana. So they had to retrace their steps. So that was when he walked through the palmettos. I never learned whether the man lived or not.
Oh, it must have been hard to get along by yourself out in the woods the way most people did.
Yes. He had a sailboat, and he traveled up and down the river, and one time they said he got becalmed down to All Galley and spent the night with Dr. Creel. And then my mother used to take him to the trains, you know, and meet him, and they would say it was time for us to come down and visit there, and the conductors knew my grandfather and everybody. They'd put us on the train here, and my grandfather would meet us down there. But it wasn't, traveling wasn't very good back then. The roads usually followed the river.
What were the roads made out of?
Well, lots of times they were just sand and, you know, like that. And there was just a short time ago, there was an article in Star Advocate, they put the 100 years and 50 years, and it said my grandfather had given oyster shells to pave Washington Avenue from down to A.A. Stewart's property. And that's where the Florida Power and Light office is now. But I know early there was just sand.
When your grandfather took the boat south for find his practice, how far south would he go?
Well, I don't know. I don't think he went maybe farther than Melbourne and up here and across the river. I know Mr. Godby told me one time, said, I used to meet your grandfather over on Merritt Island and take him to see his a patient. Said, I don't know what he charged them. He said, I charged him $5 to do it. So over the years, I've heard stories from people about.
The early businesses around Titusville, I guess industries, there was a fishing industry, I understand.
Yes, well, it was my grandfather Scobie, George W. Scobie Sr., came from Connecticut, and it was 1882 or 83, I think they came down, and I believe they said they came in an oyster boat. I don't know just what that was. And they settled here and were credited with starting the fishing industry. It was my uncle, George Scobie Jr., and my father, Frederick Scobie, and came down, and my grandmother, and it was an aunt that was born down here. And so we always, that's it. Daddy brought all kinds of fish home, crabs home, you know, and they'd get caught in the nets. And so when there wasn't anything else, there was always mullet, because they did have close season on that. But
how did they do the fishing?
it was with nets. And they said this man that wrote about the Scobies too, and my grandfather, said it seems they had a special net that they used.
They take one or two boats out?
Well, they had a skiff that they put the nets in. They put them on these, they had rails, and they put them up to dry them. And then they'd have to take them down and put them in the back of the boat, the skiff, and so they could then row and let it run out the back and set it early, I guess, in the evening, then take them up early morning. And I don't know whether it was, they had a motor boat with a motor that pulled the skiff.
Probably came
And-
later, the motors.
And they had, my grandfather had a fish house out there, and they always had a man in there to look after them. There was a big vat that they put the fish in water they dipped out of the Indian River, I think. And then it was the trout. They couldn't ship them whole. They called it gutting them. They had to slit them and take the insides out. And when they tossed them out, oh, you should see the catfish should be there. I know my sister said you look like you could walk on them. There'd be so many. But they had bottom fish, and then, of course, they'd catch others too, but it's mostly mullet and trout and bass and the panfish, bottom fish. But, oh, they went, and then my grandfather saw the need for the barrels to ship them in. So they, out on the end of the city wharf, there was a big warehouse where the steamers used to leave their products. Well, he had they call them coopers, and I've watched them make the barrels. They'd have the forms and stand the stays in them, and then shape them into a barrel and put the head on. And my sister used to drive my grandfather down to south, I think, Forest Salerno, and take orders for barrels. They shipped them out too to other people, because they'd ice them down in that, you know, and then ship them. And one time, Daddy brought, when the dresser graph came out, it was a hand-operated one. He brought it home, and we had the fun of running those cards. They printed with quotations, and we ran them off. Kids did it.
I don't think I know what an addressograph is.
Well, they had the address on cards, on metal slips, and they went through, and you put the card there, and the card would be stamped with the address.
Kind of like they do credit cards now.
I guess so. Mm-hmm.
So you had a big plant making barrels?
Yes, and then he, after many storms, the wharf finally had to be torn down, and there was about 4 houses out there, and my uncle had a marine supply because they needed for the boats and the men fishing, and so there was, my grandfather had a fish house, and my father had one, and my uncle had one. I think my uncle's was a seaboard, and I believe the one Daddy had was the Star, and I don't remember what my grandfather's was.
Where would
But
they ship the fish?
Well, I never saw so many small places in Georgia that in that group that they went, small towns up there.
So you saw
Mostly.
all those addresses when you were playing with the
Yes,
machine.
yes. Daddy brought it home and put it on the table, and of course we could run them off in no time.
Oh, that's interesting. People in Georgia eating Indian River fish.
Yes.
There must have been an ice house here then.
Oh yes, they have from pretty early days. It was Southern Electric or something, and then before the Florida Power and Light.
Mm-hmm. Do you recall the steamboats that used to come on the river, or were they a little before your time?
They were before my time.
You probably heard stories about them.
Oh yes. I've got the book that this man in Melbourne, Hopgood, is it?
Hopwood.
Hopwood. And when I wrote to him for it, he had seen, mentions of both Scobie and Holmes family, and he remarked about it.
What do you remember about the citrus industry coming in? That was...
Well, that was always a large thing. And I know they wrote that my grandfather Holmes was the first doctor that they'd ever heard of that raised his seedlings and did the budding. And he had a grove and he had a packing house and shipped.
So he did all kinds of things.
Yes, back in those days, because Grandpa didn't turn anybody down whether they had the money or not. And I know my sister took her son to Dr. Roach, I've forgotten which one time, and he mentioned, your doctor delivered me, and I don't know whether you got paid for it or not. He did. Oh, so.
So they were just starting to put in a lot of groves
Well,
here in the 20s.
Yes, and see, the big one was Nevin's Fruit Company that Mr. J.J. Parrish was in, and of course that was about the only thing except working in a grocery store or something like that. Denham's dry goods, but they were either working in the grove, because then they just had hoe and keep the weeds down and picking the fruit and shipping them, and then I think every fish house down on the dock had several outfits that went out fishing.
Mm-hmm. What other businesses were there in town? Were there any other? I guess you mentioned Denham's store.
Yes, department store. They had shoes and dry goods, and they didn't carry any women's clothes early days. I had clerked in there during Saturdays during school, and also helped do the inventory. Mm-hmm. And then later I worked in there with Mrs. Denham. And then we had Waters, and they carried men's clothing and women's shoes. And there was, of course, garage always, from the time I remember, and lawyers and surveyors, and being the county seat, I guess we had more than maybe some other places.
Well, I understand you worked in the courthouse for some years.
Yes, I went to work in 33 for Mr. H.C. Morgan. He was tax collector, and he'd just come into office, and they passed this Futch Act. And see, most of the property wasn't being taxed on the roll. There was delinquent taxes on it, and they just accumulated till they paid them off before they came back on. So that's when I first started work there. We had to put all that property, extend the tax on it, and then have a tax sale on it when it wasn't paid. So it was, and we wrote all the tax receipts, by hand. Mr. Morgan took the last part of the book and gave me the first part. I guess he thought I'd recognize more of them here. And this H.J. Waters, he always paid his tax, and his name wasn't on the check. And I couldn't read it. I always had to ask him to be sure who it was.
Do you remember any colorful characters there around the courthouse?
Well, we always, the jail was upstairs, over the old courthouse. And so you had people coming and going. You didn't know always who they were, and I think they tried to take the back door rather and up the back stairs instead of the front part. Oh, of course, there'd be a famous courts up there, and Colonel Butt from Cocoa, he was quite an orator, and you could hear him from quite a ways. because I too worked for the city in 29 and 30 for a year with Mr. J.P. Wilson. See, we had bonded for all these streets, and they couldn't pay the bonds, interest on the bonds, so people weren't paying taxes. All we were getting was some water bills. Now the Florida East Coast might have, and telephone company and something like that, but the city just wasn't getting any money in. So Mr. Wilson tried to help the people with the street paving and taxes, and he would get a bond, and he always kept that money in a cigar box separate, and he let people take a coupon or a bond, whatever they needed, because I think at that time they were just about 20 cents on the dollar. And they were trying to refund them, and I know after the city thought they couldn't pay me anymore, and Mr. Wilson had it by himself. Well, I went back a time or two while he had to go to Sanford on the refunding the bonds.
You're talking about during the Depression when a lot of things were closing down.
Oh, I know it. The bank did. See, my grandfather Scobie was president of the Bank of Titusville, and it stayed open and after most of the others had closed. But it wasn't, it was either cashier or assistant cashier. It never, the assistant left town because I think he thought he would be blamed anyway. And some of them told that the cashier was living in Orlando with a Japanese butler, and his girlfriend had a fur coat, and they were telling all kinds of stories.
Those are pretty hard times there.
Yes, they were. I know a lot of times I thought, well, I won't worry and get upset about it, but you were able to pay rent and buy groceries and dress yourself, and that was the way it was. Well, you wouldn't believe it, but I was working for $15 a week in the tax collector's office, and the girls back in the clerk's office, they were only making $55 a month, so I was making a little bit more.
I hear from some people that there was a lot of people, they would trade out things. There wasn't as much cash around.
I guess there was, but then later I worked a year for the Piggly Wiggly, and I'd been doing bookkeeping in between the time I graduated and went to business college, and so that was something because you're on your feet. And I sometimes thought I couldn't walk home, and it wasn't but about a couple of blocks. But old groceries were unbelievably cheap then. I think you could probably get 10 pounds of potatoes for a quarter, and probably 5 pounds of rice and grits and all those things. I'd never known much about some of the things we hadn't used that other people did. My mother had been, of course, grew up here, but her family were all from Ohio and had come originally from New Jersey. And the Scobies had lived in New Haven, so they were mostly cooking northern style. But I liked rice, and we'd beg the cook to fix rice for us.
Did you have home gardens?
No, where we lived in town, we didn't. Till later, now during World War II, my mother had a special bed made for a rose bed. Well, she turned it into tomatoes, and you know, we canned tomatoes, we gave tomatoes to the neighbors, and it really helped out a lot.
What was it like around here during World War II?
Well, it was, the gasoline, you know, was rationed, and even we had originally in the house there was a kerosene hot water heater, and then, you know, with us away working all day, wasn't anybody to keep fireplace going, so we put in a heater and connected in that, and you could leave it on low. Otherwise, you go home at night and you wouldn't get the house warm until bedtime. So, and they made it, oh, they were so close with it. I walked to work most of the time so I could save some gasoline, maybe to go someplace, because I had wasn't too far. I usually allowed myself 15 minutes to walk to the courthouse and hoped somebody wouldn't stop me. There were several ladies that might stop me and see me on the way. And then the attorneys, they lived south of me, so Mr. Crofton would often pick me up. And then there was a banker here and started the Citizens Bank, and he would pick me up on the way to work.
You must have gone to school here.
Oh yes, I went the first and second grade, and then we lived in Indian River City, which is part of Titusville now, while I was in the third grade, so I went to a one-room school there. But the next year I was back here in the fourth grade. Yes, went all through the 12th grade.
What would a school day be like for a little girl in second grade?
Well, you know, we walked to school and we went home for noon to eat. I know my little sister was, she just had to go to school because her two older sisters were going. Well, there was a little park across the street from the school, and my sister, my mother had to get 2 or 3 sets of books for her because she'd leave them in the park and then they couldn't be found. But it was everybody, you know, from the grades, and we usually lined up to march in. And with them nowadays, no prayer, and some of them afraid to salute the flag. We always had the flag flying, and of course we went in, we had Bible reading and prayer and music.
You pledged allegiance?
Yes. And
what was your desk like?
well, it was, they've improved on them a lot, but it wasn't, they weren't very comfortable back in those days.
Did you have an inkwell on your desk?
Well, later, after we were up, I guess, in the 8th grade, and
I've heard stories about pigtails and
yeah.
inkwells.
Oh, I had to have long hair. My mother couldn't get my 2 sisters to stand still, so they had bobbed hair, but I either had it braided or long in curls. I've forgotten when it was that she finally told me I could have it cut, and it was a Wednesday and the barber shop was closed. So she cut it the first time it was cut and only let it grow once after that.
Tell us about the speech.
Well, it was scheduled to get up and make a speech in class, and I don't remember how many minutes it was or what the subject was, but I just thought I couldn't do that, and I couldn't do it. And so I told my mother I wasn't going to school that day. Well, I got slapped, the only time I remember getting slapped, and I didn't go to school. But you know, the teacher just called on me a day or 2 later, and I got up and made it, of course, but I thought I just couldn't. I thought I was going to get out of it, but it didn't work. And I didn't like compositions too much, and we had to write, they call compositions. And I know one time I had to, it was something about Titusville or Brevard County. So I'd written my grandfather, and he wrote me this letter. I think it was dated in 1921. And he had had an accident and fractured a rib and was in bed, so he wrote it all in pencil and told me about the first sawmill that was here that Einig had, and said the son was trying to develop a whistle, but of course he couldn't test it while they were sawing the wood because there wasn't enough steam for that. So when it was shut down, at noon he would practice on his whistle.
Okay. What sort of pageants and plays did the schools put on?
Well, always the graduating class did, and I remember our year, there was only 6 members, and we'd been a big class in the 8th grade, and when we came to the 9th, people moved away and dropped out. So they had Mrs. Lovey Pritchard always directed most of the plays, and we had a time finding a play that had a small enough number. I think we had to use a few from the junior class, and I didn't much think I wanted to be in that, but I had a part that didn't have much to say. But it was, our class was so small. They had been small earlier years, but I think they were larger after that.
The community had different events on different holidays.
Yes.
Can you tell me a little bit about what happened on the 4th of July?
Well, we had, I tell you, lots of times my father hired, Wagers had Studebaker agency, and he'd hire one of them to drive us to Daytona to see the fireworks and all like that. But in real early years, I think they said that they traded around. Coco would have something, and I remember back when I was working in the courthouse, All Galley had one on Washington's birthday, and it was sort of political, I think, then, and everybody tried to go. And of course, there were different organizations putting on plays, and they usually used either the high school, or sometimes we had them in the theater. I know the Fortnightly Club, I believe it was, that put on sort of musical. I remember I was in that. We were on stage and singing, something like that, but there were different ones. I know I found quite a few of the programs, musicals and things that they'd put on over the years.
Did you have May Day celebrations?
I can remember one that they had out in front of the schoolhouse, the maypole and the children.
And I understand they used to have some sailboat regattas on the river occasionally.
Yes, my grandfather wrote about that, and then I think Conklin's, I think some had boats, and they'd been in them. And then speedboats, later. I know Mr. Wilson, the city clerk, although he was up in years, he was enthused about speedboats, and I often worked for him when he wanted to be off, and when he had vacations, when they wouldn't, give him any extra help.
Did circuses and the like come to town?
Well, we usually went to Orlando. They came there. And maybe they'd be late, and you'd get to see all the elephants and things parade in. I remember one time they were several hours late.
Let's see. I bet you remember when the first radio stations were around here and people started listening to the radio.
Well, see, we had one out here that was, I guess, the state sort of operated weather, and for years, and then when Melbourne got an airport, well, they got the radio station, and then there were some that started up, and local too, just regular news and music. And
do you remember when that was?
oh, let me see, how many years ago was it? No, I said it wasn't very good on dates.
I won't press you. Did you ever go see movies in town? Was there a movie theater?
Oh, yes. You know, Bert Johnson operated the theater here, and he called us the Dutchman. And we were some Dutch descent. And maybe he was too. Maybe, I guess he knew my mother's people and father too. And so, you know, we'd go sometimes and he wouldn't even charge us. And he'd try to keep the children, I found out of there. Let the grown people go and sit, you know, and be seated, and then let us go in, and then he wouldn't charge us. He kept them out. He figured it out. But, oh yes, it was, and it was safe. You could we could walk several blocks there, and Mother and Daddy never worried about us at all. But we were only allowed to go on Friday night because school nights you stayed home and studied and went to bed early. And Saturday night, everybody went to town. And some of them would go and park the car early to have a parking place. And because you'd see people you didn't see all week come to town and shop around, and walk around, visit around. And that was quite something to do.
Were there places to get ice cream? Or?
Yes, there was a Banner Drug Store for a long, long time, and then there was Davis, and the different ones operated. There was one where the museum is now at one time, and then in the block, and one across the street. But people just did a little shopping and visited, and the grocery stores that stay open, and hardware. And
what about, were there dances?
oh yes, we used to have street dances. You know, there it is, Washington Avenue is the main drag, but there was a light fixture in the middle of Julia and Washington Avenue, and they just rope it off, and I guess they went around. We'd have street dances, and that was when I was growing up. And then later there was dances, of course, down at Clark's Corner, and there was dances upstairs over down the corner of Julia and Washington Avenue. There was quite a large room up there, and they'd have dances. And yes, they had dances around.
Did you like to dance?
Oh, I did. I think whether I liked to eat better or dance better, I love music. Oh.
What kind of bands were there around? Did bands come in from out of town to play, or?
Well, they mostly, I know we had a family camel here, and we had a city band, and then different people played. I know there was a Mr. Linder, I think, played the drums, and somebody else would play the piano, and they'd just get a group up like that most of the time.
Let's see.
And Mother liked to dance, but she could only dance when she was away from home. You know, a Methodist church didn't approve of dancing years and years ago, and I think that's why she liked the Episcopal church. They were a little more lenient.
How would your family celebrate the holidays, like Christmas?
Oh, we always had a tree. Usually Daddy'd go out with the truck and take us all with him to cut down the cedar tree. He always preferred cedar, so and then usually later years it was my job. I remember decorating the tree on Christmas Eve before I went to midnight mass at the Episcopal church.
Tell us about how you got your drinking water back then.
Well, while I was working for the city, I was real familiar with it. I sent out the water bills, and we had a meter reader, and once a month he brought the water in the case that went to, I guess, the Board of Health to be tested. And they told me there were only 20-foot wells, and we really, at that time, had the best water on the East Coast because it didn't have salt or sulfur in it. then everybody had had rainwater tanks and or either a cistern that they could depend on for water.
Well, I guess back in those days there were quite a few mosquitoes.
Oh, were they? And it was either smudges, you know, or that you, and I know I visited my grandfather after he remarried. My first grandmother, Holmes, died, and she had a place on Merritt Island, and went over to visit them, and they had a large brush made out of palmettos. I think it hung by the door, and you were to brush all the mosquitoes off before you went in the house, and they were thick at times.
How would you deal with them? Everywhere you went there were mosquitoes.
Well, you just expected it, I guess, in those days.
Where would you put the smudge pots around?
Well, if the woman was washing, you know, she'd have it near there, or if you were put it near the door to keep them away, because they like to get around doorways, but that was, and then some people use citronella, I think, citronella. But then later, of course, they got, was it B brand, some kind of powder that you burn too? But they've been just as bad as that at times along the river. I know I call the mosquito control every once in a while because, see, they come across the river. I used to couldn't believe that. But we had a Walker Bridge that had a turnout, and you could park out there in the evening and there'd be mosquitoes out there. And so people that lived along the river got the mosquitoes the first at it.
Would you ever go over to the beach for something to do?
Oh um, before the bridge, you know, my father had a houseboat, and he'd take us, we'd go to Oceanus, and I'd forgotten just where that was, but I think it's about where Patrick is now. He had 7 acres there, and he sold it during the boom to a man in Jacksonville. Well, he fell down on it, didn't pay it all, and Daddy gave it to him. And I thought, oh, he should have kept one lot. He ought to have kept a corner of it. But he didn't. But we had traveled on the houseboat up to Klondike, and it drops off there. You couldn't swim or anything. It was real steep, but I remember going up there and see he'd go across the river and through the Banana Creek in the Banana River. And then, of course, we'd go across and go over to the beach across the way, and then we finally got the bridge, and we had a good beach at DeSoto Beach. Playa Linda isn't wide and nice and liable to drop off. And at one time I found myself on the edge, and I was scared to try to move, and somebody realized I was, and they came out and got me, and I was careful after that not to get on the edge of a hole or something, because I didn't think I was a very strong swimmer. Yes, we'd go and spend the day, and Daddy always would, going over Banana River, he'd take a skiff along and oyster tongs, and he knew where all the oysters were, and he'd open up the oysters for us, real fresh.
Sounds like the food was pretty good around.
Yes.
Let's see, what else? You mentioned a couple of different jobs you've had. Maybe you can tell us the kind of jobs that you had coming up. First, you went to high school, and then you went to a business college
in Jacksonville, and then I came home, and I was bookkeeper, I think, with Smith and Gruber. They'd bought out Waters, and during the lunch hour, I usually waited on customers, but the rest of the time I was bookkeeper. And then after, I think they closed out and sold out, and then there was a garage, Wilder's garage, and I was a bookkeeper there, so I learned all about the parts. I had to order parts for cars and check them out to them. And it was during Prohibition, and there was a man here that had all these big Studebakers, and they picked up the liquor over on the beach and took it around the different places around Florida, I guess, and maybe out of state. So Wilder serviced all those cars before they go out again. So they had a good business besides the local business.
And after you worked at the repair shop?
Well, let me see. Then I think it was after the city that I worked Piggly Wiggly a year, and then they wanted to transfer me to Cocoa. Well, the salary wasn't much, and all of my mother and brother and I living together, we shared in expenses, and I thought, well, I wouldn't be having much that way if I had to board and room, so I gave up that job. I didn't want to go. And maybe then it was, I clerked in the drugstore for a while, and it was, let me see, one day Mr. Holton had a cleaning shop, and he wanted to go fishing, and he wanted me to stay in the cleaning shop that day. I thought, well, I hope I didn't mix up anybody's clothes. And then there was a little Better Food store, and they'd had a couple running that. Well, they had to give it up, so they were after me. I was manager, buyer, and salesperson and everything. I did that for a while. Then there was Mr. Gould from Cocoa bought out a store here. I think it was Walker's, and they had a little bit of everything. Seemed like it was vases and I don't know what all they didn't have. Well, he was after me, and I worked in that a while. I don't know. I don't know.
Like you probably got to know everybody in town, huh?
Well, and Mims too, working the grocery store, and people came in from Shiloh and Allenhurst, and you did, and Scottsmore, people that later moved into Titusville. And of course, all the, they had small schools, but the high school students from Mims and all around came in Titusville.
Tell us a little bit about what's happened with land values since your family first came here.
Well, it was, when you read it, seemed impossible that they could buy land for that price. It was, I remember, even up to 41, I think it was, they raised the values because there'd been state taxes prior to 41, and then from 41 on it'd be just county taxes. And some of the lots were valued at $10 on the roll, and they put them 40. And some of these subdivisions way out, you probably couldn't find the lot without a surveyor. And there was a lot of them over on the island that way. And I know the place we were in, I think when we bought it in 48, I believe it was only assessed at $2,000. And now, my goodness, I think they've got it up to about 70. And one time, the lots before the Depression, before the boom broke, those lots along the river there on Riverside Drive were 10,000. In 48, when we were living there, the woman had expected to come back. She was teaching in Jacksonville, and she got rheumatoid arthritis and bedridden, so her brother said cheaper to sell it when you're alive and go through the state. So he offered it to us for $8,000, a 2.5-story house. And of course it needed painting and needed a new roof, and now the house next door to us, of course, it had had some improvement, but I think it sold for $200,000. And the painter years ago said we could probably get $175 for ours. Well, I sort of doubted it then, but when some of them, they wanted $400,000 for them, but I think they came down before they sold them. We had 3 on Riverside Drive, and a woman called me not long ago and wanted to put ours up for sale. I said, well, we're not ready to do that yet. But I would like to be on a 1-story, all on one floor.
It's amazing. I guess there was a time there during the boom when a lot of Northerners came down here.
Yes, and bought, and you know, because our town was had gone default on the bonds, there was years and years that no one could build in Titusville unless you had the money. You couldn't borrow. They wouldn't. And even when they said there was 2 houses built over a period of about 20 years, that was this Hennessy's came here with a lot of money, and there was a Dr. Rhodes that retired and built a house, but you just couldn't do it.
I hadn't heard that part of the story, but it makes sense.
See, when I went to work in the courthouse, they were trying to get the property back on the tax roll with that Futch Act, and then when that didn't work too well, they passed the Murphy Act, they call it. Well, you could buy those certificates up practically at cost, and after you held them 2 years, you could apply for a tax deed, or if people were the owner, they could buy them up and then cancel them. And they see the Futch Act had put everything back on the tax roll and gave them a chance to pick it up and pay on, and when they didn't do that, then they passed the other. So it made a lot of work, but of course property got valuable and people didn't let it go like they did. But I saw the tax list this last year. I don't know where it was. I got a hold of paper anyway. I was maybe in here. And I couldn't believe the length of the tax list. I didn't see very much in Titusville, but oh, that was tremendous. Yeah. I'm glad I'm out of the courthouse before they started. Oh, subdividing and subdividing. I had to, Mr. Simmons, sometimes they'd forget to pay the taxes on the property, the acreage they were subdividing, and then it was hard to pay off of one lot in a big subdivision, so he used to insist that I check every plat that was being filed to be sure they had to state if there was mortgage and had to have the taxes paid. So I used to be familiar with all of them that were being filed.
When did you leave the courthouse?
In June of '67. Some of the attorneys said I couldn't do it because they had depended on me looking up information for them. And I said, oh, yes, but I was, because that wasn't the easiest job. See, the county could foreclose on those certificates after 2 years old, they still were unpaid. So they had Brevard foreclosures. Then some of the property that hadn't been taken up in the Murphy Act and the Futch Act, that title reverted to Trustees Internal Improvement Fund, and we had a great list of those, and that's where lots of time a lot was $10 and the cost of advertising. Of course, they could run the bid up, somebody else could, but we had, and then we had the tax deeds too that people applied for, so we had about 4 kinds of deeds that where we had to search. They did one time have the tax deeds searched by an abstract company, but the trustees' deeds, I had to chase it back to the subdivision and find owner. And you know, it's surprising, sometimes they went to the owner.
Well, you were here when the space program.
Oh yes, I remember that. It was, they called it Joint Long Range Proving Ground. And you know, I had to go through the tax list and mark every one of those certificates, and I was glad I didn't have to write the whole name. I could just write the Joint Long Range Proving Ground. I went on vacation about that time, and Mr. Simmons' secretary was taking over that, and wasn't too busy then, and I was so afraid she'd miss and sell one to somebody. And oh, I had to go up to George Young's court. There was one parcel that was being closed and had a tax deed on it. So I was supposed to be custodian of those, so I had to go over there, and I was a little bit nervous about it, but they were, and see, the lawyers knew me by Beth, but I always signed the tax receipts, M. Elizabeth, I think. My bank account was that way, and so they summoned me as Beth Scobie, and I thought, what should I do? Keep my mouth shut? So I did. I said, yes, my name is Beth Scobie, and I guess everything, I didn't want to mess things up. But Mr. Rurick had, Francis G., I think, had come up from Miami, and he was in charge of it, and he'd call over and want me to make a tax statement if there was any, and get any mortgages or anything that are out. And I always went to the post office after 5 o'clock anyway, and I'd always see they got in. So he said, when he heard I was retiring, he said he was going to try to close out everything I left, because some of the others didn't think it was so important he should get them. But they'd set the case up, and then he had to get all that information, and he didn't like to run over for it.
Mm. How many people were living out there on the Cape when they first brought in the proving ground?
Oh, I don't know, but there was a lot of people up at Allenhurst and Shiloh, you know, and then there were people over here at Wilson or Cena, and so I don't know just how many moved out, but there was, heard how many families, they let some people keep their groves, I think, and maintain them. Mm-hmm. But they were just about to get a road up the coast, and people, they had it over there along the beach. They had it zoned for this and that and the other, and people from Palm Beach and around had property over there. And here came that queered it all for them. We lost our beaches except for certain times. And DeSoto was a nice wide beach and had a casino and houses there.
Tell us a little bit about what happened to Titusville when the space program came in.
Oh, we had an influx of people. I know I was teaching Sunday school at St. Gabriel's, and we had all these young couples with children come in, and oh, it really was crowded for a while, and so many coming in, and we grew, seemed like, by leaps and bounds. And it was, I know, first we knew, you know, that was people, there was some came from Washington looking around for property, buy up property cheap, and before we really knew what was happening. And then when they started the foreclosures and things, well, it was really busy.
Did you know what was going on when those first rockets went up?
No, see, they wouldn't tell you about them. Now, if somebody's husband didn't come home from work, they usually figured there was going to be put up a rocket, and they'd turn on the searchlight. See, we lived along the river. So many evening I walked up and down the Riverside Drive looking, and when the lights went off, well, then you knew, and the shot hadn't gone, it was postponed. But sometimes I'd be hanging up clothes in the backyard and see one go up. But it was so secretive at first. And but there were a lot of families here.
Mm-hmm. Must have changed the town a little bit.
Oh, it did. They wanted more, you know, and of course we finally got the malls, you know. It was just, everything was in the downtown area till they started building. They built the Searstown Mall and then the Miracle City Mall, and then they were the first ones. But now the stores are so scattered. They move farther out and farther out.
Well, at the end of the 60s, the Apollo program was finished, and a lot of people left, I guess.
Yes, they did, and they was sort of anxious about it, whether it would, you know, be any more work.
You were telling us a little bit before, if you could tell us again about that summer when you spent your holiday over on that part of the world.
Yes. Well, it was my first experience. No refrigeration, no electric lights, and it was a great big 2-story house. And I know one day I diced potatoes and I was going to cream them. Well, my uncle came in while we were out and he mashed them up, so we had potato soup. And that day changed our plans for dinner. But you could have no fresh meat, you know, and
where was it that you were staying?
At my uncle's place on the east bank of the Banana River at Cape Canaveral. And there was a Whitten family over there, and they're here now. And when I was in the hospital in Melbourne, he and his wife came to see me, and they didn't tell me the name, but said, the man said he knew you 68 years ago. And I said, well, that must be Woodrow Whitten. And they remembered he got his start in honey. My uncle had bees, and they used them to pollinate the blossoms and have better fruit crops. So he got his start. I think he bought the equipment from my uncle. But the Everwine boys and Everwines lived up at Artesia. I think their mother had been postmaster there for years. So Philip and Bill and Elizabeth would come up, and Phil took me to up the casino one night, and we had to go up with the tides, you know, and go over the sand dunes at just certain places to cross. And so you had to know your tides real well to be sure to get there and get back.
You would go there by boat?
No, by car. And see, that's why we had to drive the beach. There wasn't any roads then. And I remember years later, there was this Wager family. It had the Studebakers, and this one son had a cut-down one. And I don't know, there must have been 6 of us or 8 of us maybe on that thing. Well, I don't know whether we told my mother what we were going to do or not, but we went across to the beach, and we went to Savannah's, mind you, up to Cape Canaveral, up to the light. And I believe they persuaded the caretaker to let us go in. Of course, he wasn't supposed to. And then coming back, we rode the beach. And oh, I thought, I hope they see that crossover when we get to Playa Linda. I sure didn't want to go all the way to New Smyrna that night. But that was a ride. But he knew his way, and we had a safe trip there and back again. But that's the way people had to drive. before there was, and they depended on the tides.
Must have taken a little longer to get places.
Oh, it did. I remember when we went to Daytona, you know, it was sort of a sand road thrown up through the hammock, and there were just certain places you passed. It was just one way. So it took quite a long time. It said it would take most all day to drive to Jacksonville, where they go up in a few hours now.
Did you ever see any of the big turtles that would come up the beach over in Cape Canaveral?
Well, we've had, I think, years ago where they would lay their eggs and see we brought, Daddy let us bring some small alligators on one time. He put a tub down in the sand and built a pen, and I don't know how long we kept them or what happened to them, but I think we had 3 or 4 alligators and small ones in the backyard. And I used to swim in the pool over at Canaveral Club. They had it was artesian water, and we'd swim in there.
Guess there were quite a few different kinds of wildlife we don't see so much here anymore.
Yes.
Did you ever hear any stories about bears out on the Cape?
Well, I've eaten bear meat. When I had dinner one time at Artesia, they had killed a bear and canned it. Yes, they had bear meat.
How was it?
It was fine. They knew how, I guess, to do it. I've even eaten armadillo. My brother had seen somebody kill one and cook one, so he had to bring one home and fix it. And I guess it was all right.
Did you ever run into any big snakes out there in the...
No, you know, over the years we picked huckleberries and blackberries, and they said, you better watch out. And we used to pick them down in the Inner City area, and then blackberries up north, and I think Loretta or something like a place called that, and never saw a snake. No, for years, the only rattlesnake I'd seen was one in a cage on the riverfront down at Sharps. Somebody had one in a cage. One time there was one on a back street, and somebody killed it. But all my years I never had, walked up one. I was always afraid I'd be frozen on the spot.
I've heard some tales of panthers out there. I don't know, did you ever hear about any of
No. My brother liked to hunt ducks. Now, he hunted over on the Merritt Island, but after they put up those shelters and everything, and they cut the amounts you could get down, well, he didn't think it was worth. He was a real good shot, and I'd sit down on the back porch with him and pick ducks and skin coots, and after he brought them in, and we'd had them, freeze them. But he didn't go in for after he came back from the service, World War II, he decided to go squirrel hunting. But neither one of us liked squirrels, so he didn't go squirrel hunting anymore. But he had a friend that had a garden, and the rabbits were getting in. He did bring some rabbits home. Now they were young and they were good. And I have eaten turtle, and years and years ago, and gopher, I think, some.
Yeah, they're and everything that came out of the river, I guess.
Yes, we had shrimp and oysters and all kinds of fish.
Did you have clams back then, or was it?
I guess they did, but I don't think, I think Daddy preferred the oysters and shrimp, so that's what we had most of the time. Slumber parties, and I know there was Ms. Osborne that had a big house and a large family, and so that was a great place, and Ms. Osmond would be around all to supervise and keep an eye on everybody and keep them straight. But they one time having slumber parties. And then, of course, I had a friend, Eleanor Smith, and she lived with her grandfather, and it was a large house, and she used to have several of us in to dance, just a few couples. And her mother was real strict on them going anywhere, and it used to be we'd maybe get a group in the car and ride around, you know, and we'd have a hard time talking Eleanor and Ann out. But her mother was there and had the children, and the father was working in the north, and the grandfather, they were living with them. So Ann and Eleanor usually had a hard time getting out. Our mothers, we told them where we went, and she trusted us, but they didn't. But it was, and then they used to have, our churches had card parties, and I know, there was a porch, a nice porch all around Captain Knight's house, and they often would have the card parties there. And then Mrs. Parrish would have card parties. There was a Ms. Mandeville here that her husband had a jewelry store, and she thought every girl should learn to play bridge. Well, it was while I was working in that garage, and Monday I had all of Saturday's business. And I really didn't feel like sitting around the card table and learning bridge. And I did it, but I wasn't too happy. And then I went to some of the card parties, but I was always happy when somebody else got the bid and I could sit back and watch. I didn't enjoy that. And then, of course, I belonged to the auxiliary veterans, and there one time, and they had the auxiliary, and they had card parties, but mostly it was some of the simpler games that I enjoyed. Then one time the church, they thought every time we had a meeting we had to play bingo, and some of that wore off, and we split up, and the older women, they didn't like it when the younger women split up. It didn't. And so they were trying to get us back, but I think that was the main thing. The younger ones got tired of playing bingo. And of course one time we had suppers to make money. There was a large building that sat across on the corner across from City Hall now, and it was a woman's club got it, and they had a library upstairs, but there was a kitchen and large room downstairs. There could have been dances there too, and then the church put on suppers, and they kept pretty busy with things back there, one kind of entertainment the other.
What would the men do? Were there pool halls or?
Oh yes, there was always those in town. And
were there any saloons?
Oh yes, there was. I know when our Episcopal minister came here, we had he thought there were too many saloons in town, too many temptations. But there was, and you know, the saloons and things had always been on the west side of Washington Avenue, and you know, you just didn't feel right going down that side of the street. I'd cross across if I had to, but you always went down the east side. That's where most of the shops were, because there was benches out there, and sometimes there'd be some of them sitting around, and people usually dodged the west side of the street unless they had some special business over there.
Well, there was a time when liquor was not readily available. What happened to the saloons during that period?
Well, they still sold it, and my mother used to get real mad because of the one that would deliver it also. And my father, there for a while, was drinking, and he would have to have his, certain times a day, and she made her real mad when she saw this particular man coming.
You mentioned that there was a particular group of people who had some real good cars. They would pick up some of this on the beach. What was going on? What was the whole story?
He evidently was, I don't know whether he had it shipped over from Bimini, and then he had all these people to drive these cars around. It was Paul White, and he served some time in Atlanta for it. And I think learned to make ice. That's one thing he learned while he was there, I heard. And of course everybody knew Paul and his wife and his daughter and didn't think any less of him. And one time we had some of the group of Prohibition living next door to us, and of course I knew all this was going on and wondered when they were going to get caught. So, oh.
The big ships came over from the Bahamas, and they'd
Yes.
meet them on the shore somewhere?
Well, they'd land it over on the beach, understood.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I guess that was happening all along the coast here.
Oh, yes, I guess.
I heard stories down in Sebastian. Same
Yes,
kind of thing.
And a lot of it was over here, and he had those heavy cars, and I guess the springs were reinforced and everything, so they could carry quite a load.
But didn't shut down all the saloons.
No, and then of course they were making moonshine around. And if they'd get a still and break it up, well, they just get a new one and keep going.
Let's see. Can you remember the first airplanes that came through here?
Well, we were in school, and we were on the second floor and on the riverside, and there used to be small planes, the biplanes, as they call them, and would fly around, and that's when they'd get the teacher off on the subject of flying and get off the subject of we were supposed to be on. And of course we had Dunfield out here from early years before we got Tyco.
Did they use planes for crop dusting in the citrus field?
No, they didn't use it for that. They don't. Most of theirs was spraying and I think they did that in the groves with the tank, and that way I don't believe they ever sprayed them that way. I think they did it south in those big farms more, the crop dusting.
And did you ever get a ride on one of the planes?
See, the county commissioner took me up one time, and we flew over Merritt Island and round and stopped by Tyco and then came up to Dunfield. I didn't think I cared too much for the little planes. We went to Panama while my niece was down there, her husband was stationed, and my mother and sister and I. She said her daughter was so homesick, couldn't come home, and so we just had to go down and visit her. So we drove to Miami and got a plane there and went down, and it was a nice ride over the water. It wasn't rough. And then I had a nephew that was in Chelsea, Mass, the hospital there, and he was living in Maldron, I think it was. And I went up and spent some time, about 9 days, with him. I never thought I'd ever get around Cape Cod and Plymouth and all those places, but he took me all around to see all the places of interest in Boston and around.
When
And that was a nice flight. Took it from Orlando.
When you went up in the little plane and saw the area where you'd been living, how did it look different than
Well,
from the ground?
Well, you see, most of it was, we were over Merritt Island mostly, and I didn't realize there was so much water over there.
Do you remember any hurricanes that ever came through?
Yes, the one in 26, we just arrived in Titusville from my aunts in Washington, and of course Daddy couldn't meet us, and they were there trying to get the boats out of the water and everything safe, and it was, we got home, and of course everybody tying down everything that thought would blow and away, and then my sister had started from Miami with a friend, and they got down there, and they had a time getting in to Miami, but they finally convinced them that they would help with the, relief effort, and so they did get in. We were a little bit anxious knowing they were on the way down there in that storm, but they got in and got back safely.
Did the winds blow up here?
Yes, I think blew fruit off the trees, and whipped things pretty bad, and the river, rose quite high, and but we didn't have, I don't think, too much damage, really.
How did they know the hurricane was coming?
Well, they had a warning. See, we had a Western Union office years ago, and they got the weather, and then of course the post office, watches the weather, and they kept, and of course with the fishing and the boats, they had to keep up on that too.
Were you here when any of the other storms came through?
Yes, I think one night I spent most of the night getting up. We had screens, it locked, and water would blow in and get between the windows and the screens, and of course I spent most of the evening, I think, going around and unhooking them and getting the water out. And one time they threatened it to come right in at Canaveral. Well, we didn't believe it, but we knew that we had to do something. My brother went out and bought all the plywood he could find, and because we had 20 windows, I think, in that house, and in the attic too, and so he went and got all this plywood, and of course it didn't do any damage. He left it on for a while. But we did have, one time I was sitting in the house and there alone, and the window up in the attic blew out, and it wasn't all floored, but I had located a piece of plywood and a hammer and some nails in case something did happen. And so I did get it nailed up, and we got that window. And we had some screens of the front porch upstairs. Instead of screening the whole thing, they'd had it in panels. Well, we had some of those blow out and never did find one, so I've had it screened solid now so we don't have to bother with that. But if we had anything like they've had in Homestead in Miami, I don't know whether there'd been anything left. I sure was thankful when I heard there was a high pressure area that was turning it away. That saved us.
From Hurricane Andrew.
Yes.
Yeah, it looked like it was going to come here, didn't it?
Yes. They said, but as long as, I said, well, where is the high pressure area? And then when I found my nephew, one lives in Chesapeake, and there was that high pressure area was up there too. And he has a beach house at New Smyrna Beach. It's not right on the bluff, it's back on Atlantic Avenue. And of course, he watches the weather all the time too, and we were all relieved when that kept it. I was hoping it'd either go out to sea or go up the Gulf, one or the other.
That was a tough one.
No, we've lived through the scares of them, but you know, none have really ever hit here. We just either went west of us or east of us.